'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. We have a very fascinating show. Today we're going to explore neuromarketing and the Triune brain. With us today is Patrick Wenoir. Patrick Wenoir is the co-founder of SalesBrain.com. He's also the co-author of the first book on neuromarketing, which has been printed in 12 languages. They have trained over 84,000 people. Here are a list of some of the awards that Patrick and his partner have accrued over the years, I think since 2008. Thank you so much for joining the circle, Patrick.
Good afternoon, Carlos. Nice to see you.
So, first question, what got you interested in this field?
Well, for a long time, I've been having two passions. And one of my passions was sales and marketing. And in fact, I spent my life selling very expensive and very complicated systems. I became an expert in what's called complex selling, solutions that cost tens of millions of dollars, even sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's one of my passions. And I always had another passion, which is the brain. And typically, you don't find that a lot of business people read these books about the brain. And the field of neuroscience, or what we know on how the brain works today, has just exploded over the last 5 to 10 years. And there is just a tremendous amount of knowledge that we have acquired. The problem is none of this knowledge is made available to the normal people who don't have a PhD in neuroscience, because it's obviously a very complicated science. So about 14 years ago, I started a quest to simplify all this knowledge about the brain and make it understandable for people who do not have a PhD in neuroscience. And more importantly, to also translate that really into the world of business. Again, because we know so much more about how people use their brain to make buying decisions. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're a salesperson, if you're a CEO, what should you do differently to make sure that not only your product, but also the strategy that you build around your product to help promote that product will have the proper impact on the brain of your potential prospects.
That's fascinating. That's great. So let's start off. I know, you want to begin with the Triune brain, or you want to talk a little bit about the Reptilian brain?
Well, I'd love to. Actually, the Reptilian brain is part of those three brains that you mentioned. So one of the discovery that has been made clear over the last few years is that it's not like if we had one brain, but it's more like if we had three brains, and it's called the Triune model of the brain. So neuroscientists have demonstrated that whenever we decide, those three brains are not always in agreement. In other words, they argue, but they also have come to the conclusion that the part of our brain that decides is not what makes us intelligent. It's not what we call the neocortex. It's actually what we call the reptilian brain. In other words, if you think about it today, we have three brains. Now, on the outside part of the brain, we have what's called the new brain, or the neocortex. And it's what makes us uniquely human. This is what gave our name to our species. Our species is called Homo sapiens, which means the ones who think. Why? Because before we decide, we go, what do I think about the decision? But guess what? The decision-making portion of the brain is just a decision influencer. It is not the decision maker. It has one vote, but it's not the boss. So the second layer in the brain is called the middle brain. It goes more towards the inside of the brain. And the job of the middle brain is really to help you process the emotion linked to making that decision. So first you go, what do I think about the decision? And you use your neocortex. And then you go, how do I feel about the decision? But guess what? This is, again, only a decision influencer. Neuroscientists and some of the top experts on the role of the brain in decision have demonstrated that when we decide, we use the most internal part of the brain. It has many different names in the medical literature. Sometimes people call it the reptilian brain. It's also called the old brain. Sometimes people call it the first brain. Sometimes people miscall it the limbic system, but it doesn't matter what you call it. What matters is that we use the most ancient part of our brain to make all our decisions. And that's the discovery that we made about 14 years ago. And for the last 14 years, we have accumulated more and more evidence that if you can speak directly to the reptilian brain of your audience, people will understand you better, people will remember you better, and at the end of the day, they will be more willing to buy your idea or to let themselves be influenced by you. So our model is based on the fact that the reptilian brain plays a key role. Now, we are scientists in my company, so we do not ask people to trust us. In other words, we have extracted that from a number of very, very important researchers. One of them is a fellow by the name of Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman was a professor of psychology at Princeton, and he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And in his model, he talks about the fast brain, which we call the reptilian brain, and the slow brain, which he calls the neocortex. And actually, his work won him the Nobel Prize in Economy in 2002. And the conclusion of Kahneman's work is that although we think we're really smart people today in 2014, are what he calls system one. You know, the system one is that fast brain, what we call the reptilian brain. He calls it system one. But that system one here, he says, still rolls today. That's kind of puzzling because we think we're rational, but in reality, our instinctual brain plays a much stronger role in the final decision than the neocortex, which is the rational brain, or even the middle brain, which is the emotional brain. So it's like we have three cells, if you want. We have the rational us, then we have the emotional us, but neuroscientists have demonstrated that today, the instinctual us still plays a greater role in what we decide.
So, wow, so it almost seems like we've lost free will to a certain degree.
You're absolutely right.
That's amazing. So let's go a little deeper into this now. How does the reptilian brain work?
Well, the reptilian brain is a very, very ancient brain. It's very old. That's hence its name. We share this brain with reptiles and crocodiles and all these animals. So if you look at a brief history of time, the first form of life appeared on Earth about 1 billion years ago. And the reptilian brain appeared about 500 million years ago. Now, just to contrast this with how old Homo sapiens is, do you know, Carlos, how old we are as a species?
I have no idea.
Our species is very young. We're only about 200,000 years old. That's Homo sapiens.
That's how I feel.
About 3 to 4 million years ago, this is when Homo erectus started to appear. But if you look at our brain, you would notice that the reptilian brain is much more ancient than this. Again, the reptilian brain is approximately 500 million years old. So it's a brain that is, by definition, very, very primitive. In fact, in our model, we'll tell people that there are only 6 stimuli that can trigger that brain. But to go back to some of the interesting contrasts between the neocortex and the reptilian brain, let me tell you a little bit more about the neocortex. So again, our neocortex is approximately 5 to 10 million years old. By contrast, the reptilian is 50 times older, 500 million years old. Now, our neocortex, our new brain, is very smart. I mean, this is where you can solve nonlinear equations. This is where you can send a rocket to the moon. This is where you can do very complex thinking. This is where ethics reside. This is what makes us uniquely human, very smart. But the cost of being smart is that brain, the neocortex, is very slow. By contrast, the reptilian brain is not very smart, but it's a brain that works very, very quickly. You know, an example of that is if you think of a fly, and a fly only has about 20,000 neurons in its brain. The fly will survive not based on the quality of its decision, but the fly will survive based on how quickly it can escape your hand. So by nature, our reptilian brain is wired to make very, very quick decisions, even though those decisions might not be very smart. And why is that? It's because speed is more important for survival than smarts. Now, the reptilian brain doesn't have a notion of time. It's a brain that lives in what the expert call the immediate experience. And the immediate experience is a window of approximately 7 seconds long. By contrast, your neocortex can think about the past and can forecast things for the future, right? So your neocortex has this ability to deal with the notion of time with the past, the present, the future. The reptilian brain does not understand any of that. The reptilian brain only lives in the window of what they call the immediate experience, about 7 seconds. Now, your neocortex can be on and off. In other words, if you concentrate enough, you can quiet your neocortex and you can make it think about nothing. By contrast, your reptilian brain will always be on. There is not an off button in your reptilian brain. Why? Because think about it. If you're asleep at the bottom of your cave and suddenly a bear enters your cave, you got to be able to react to it. You've got to be able to do something about it. You've got to be able to either fight or flight the bear. So your reptilian brain, even when you're asleep, works like a radar and scan your environment for danger. Remember that our reptilian brain is wired to help us survive. It's the organ of survival. Then your reptilian brain also does not require any effort. In other words, most likely you're not aware that you have a reptilian brain and you're not even aware what your reptilian brain does for you. But for example, your reptilian brain controls your breathing, your heart rate, your body temperature, your digestion. And luckily, you don't have to think about all this. It's automatic and it goes below your level of consciousness. And then finally, your reptilian brain cannot be controlled. You know, if you tell people, don't panic, of course people will panic, right? Your reptilian brain overrides your natural will. And when people, you know, if they see smoke and you tell them, don't run, don't panic, they will still do it because the reptilian brain hijacks their brain at that moment. So these are some of the working principles of the reptilian brain. It's a very, very ancient brain.
Now, Pat, I know in some decisions that we make, past associations, past experiences, the way we were brought up, and what part of the brain do you see those fitting in?
Are you talking about memory?
Yes, like a memory.
Well, memory is still one of the most complicated subjects that is being debated by neuroscientists. The difficulty with memory is that if you take the analogy with a computer, on a computer, the memory has a specific location, right? In other words, you have the RAM, you have your hard disk, all these are forms of different kinds of memories, right? But they have a location. The problem with memory in the brain, it doesn't really have a location. In other words, there is not a single neuron that would store information. In fact, it's in the pattern of firing of those neurons that memory takes its source. So the issue of deciding where memory is in the brain, it is not really a proper question because we know it's not a location, it's a pattern of firing of neurons.
Now, so does the reptilian brain have any capacity for that? I mean, can we embed some kind of memory to develop a habit through the reptilian brain?
Well, the experts have found that there is a very specific region in the brain which is located pretty much between the middle brain and the reptilian brain, which encodes memory. And that part of the brain tells us that whenever we experience a thought or an event, if that section of the brain says, this is important, I have to remember it, those neurons in that region of the brain will encode it to make an emotional marking which will help us remember that experience. And that region in the brain has a very specific location. Again, it sits somewhere between the reptilian brain and the middle brain. But other than that, again, the process of memory is so complicated that the researchers are still decoding how our memory works.
Well, let me ask you this. We covered the neocortex, we covered the reptilian. Can you talk a little bit about the middle part of the brain?
Well, in Kahneman's book, he talks about system 1 and system 2. And in what he calls system 1, he adds the reptilian brain and the middle brain. We use the separation here. In fact, that model of the brain is pretty old. It's about 50 to 60 years old. So a lot of researchers are still arguing also with that model. But what we know is, again, that hierarchy of thoughts, which is, on one hand, you have the thinking portion of the brain, then you have the emotional portion of the brain, and then you have the instinctual portion of the brain. And in Kahneman's book, he talks about system 1, which is both the reptilian and the middle brain. So excellent. You have to understand that a lot of the knowledge that we have, which is both neurological and psychological about the brain, are very complicated, and simplifying the model is 80% of the battle.
Yeah, I can see that. You're absolutely right. It's a very complicated process. And I know in part 2 of the segment, we're going to start looking at how your company translated this model or this concept of the reptilian brain, the neocortex middle brain, into marketing or neuromarketing.
Yes, if you want, I can briefly describe what are some of the working principles of the reptilian brain.
Yes, please do.
Neuroscientists have showed that because that reptilian brain is so primitive, it is so ancient, it can only be stimulated by one of 6 stimuli. Because again, think about it, 500 million years ago, we were not very smart. So those stimulus had to be very simple, very down to earth. So the first stimulus is that reptilian brain is completely selfish. In other words, your reptilian brain doesn't care about anything else but your own survival. There is nothing more important for your reptilian brain than you. You are the center of the universe. And anything which is outside of your own body, typically your reptilian brain cannot really care less. In other words, there is no compassion whatsoever at the level of the reptilian brain. It's all about me, me, and me. So that's the first stimulus. It's self-centered. The second stimulus is contrast. Contrast as in before, after. Contrast as in warm, cold. Contrast as in without air, with hair. Now, if you think about it, I'm sure you heard the story, but if you take a frog and put a frog in boiling water, the contrast in the temperature of the frog will trigger an immediate decision for the frog to jump out of the bowl of water, right? But if you take that same frog and you put the frog in lukewarm water, the frog will be happy. In fact, if you slowly heat up the water underneath the frog, a number of frogs might stay till the point of death. Why? Because the absence of contrast prevents the frog's reptilian brain to make the decision to jump. Another example of this is, imagine you go to a place like a cocktail party, and at the beginning, the room is pretty quiet, right? And all of a sudden, more and more people walk in, people are starting to talk louder and louder, so you're sipping on your glass, talking with somebody, and you do not even notice it, but you have started to raise the volume of your voice so that the person in front of you hears you, right? So all of a sudden now it's really, really noisy and there's music in the background. The whole environment is extremely noisy, but you have not noticed anything, right? But then here's what happened. If all of a sudden, somebody turns off the music, everybody will go, what's going on, right? In other words, all of a sudden there was a decrease, there was a contrast in the outer noise environment. And your reptilian brain says, I detected contrast, which means maybe your survival can be jeopardized, so it will make you scan your environment. And when the people turn off the music, everybody in the room looks at each other like this, figuring out what happened, right? So your reptilian brain is wired to detect contrast because when there is contrast, it means a bear entered your cave, right? But if the cave was quiet, no problem. All of a sudden, if you hear a roar in your cave, you've got to wake up. The third stimulus is tangible. In other words, the reptilian brain cannot understand abstract or intangible concept. Why? Because your reptilian brain is the brain of survival, and it's a brain that does not understand even words. Why? Because words, in terms of evolution, are only about 40,000 years old, and that's for spoken words. Written words are only 20,000 years old, anywhere from 10 to 20,000 years for written words. And your reptilian brain, which is 500 million years old, has a hard time to understand words because they did not have enough time in evolutionary terms to make an impact on the reptilian brain. So what that means is your reptilian brain does not understand abstract concepts such as, well, we are one of the leading provider of, and we provide our end user with an easy-to-use solution, etc. Why? Because all these concepts are very neocortex, they are very abstract. By contrast, your reptilian brain loves to touch things, to feel things. It's a brain that you cannot easily fool. The fourth stimulus is beginning and end. In other words, your brain is wired to remember things at the beginning of an interaction, to remember things at the end of an interaction, but it will forget pretty much everything in between. So we have a really nice U-curve here. So that phenomenon in psychology has a name. It's called the recency-precency effect. It was discovered about 60 years ago. It's been demonstrated by countless university studies. But the fact that our brain will remember the things at the beginning of an interaction and the end of interaction can have a lot of consequences on how people should build their sales and marketing strategy. Then the fifth stimulus is visual. In fact, let me ask you a question, Carlos.
Yes.
How many windows are there in your kitchen and dining room?
Two.
All right. Now, what did you do to get the answer?
I had to look around my dining room in my head.
Right.
Right.
So what you did is you pictured your kitchen and your dining room in your head. Typically, you position yourself in the middle of it, not outside of your building, but inside your kitchen, right? So if you visualize one window in my kitchen, you turn your head mentally, and you went another one, 1 + 1 = 2. In fact, when you ask this question to anybody, everybody does it the same way. In other words, you deliberately switched your brain into a visual mode to process that question. Well, guess what? That visual mode right here is the native mode of the reptilian brain. Remember I said that the reptilian brain has a hard time to understand words because the concepts of words are very recent in evolutionary term? Well, guess what? The brain, especially the reptilian brain, loves visual. Doesn't like words, but it loves pictures.
Interesting.
In fact, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective again, we had eyes before we were smart. In other words, the eye is an older structure than the neocortex itself. You know, the eye is approximately 200 million years old. And then finally, the last stimulus to trigger the reptilian brain is emotion. So, in other words, if you want to reach the reptilian brain, if I tell you, Carlos, why don't you multiply 24 by 17? When you're going to do that math exercise, 24 multiplied by 17, there is no real emotion in it, right? It's not going to jeopardize your survival. So that stimulus, because it has no emotional component to it, by definition, it will not reach your reptilian brain. Why? Because the reptilian brain, if it's not emotional, if it has nothing to do with your survival, the reptilian brain is not interested, right? So again, there are only 6 stimuli: self-centered, contrast, tangible, beginning and end, visual, and emotional. So if you want to trigger the reptilian brain, you have to use one or more of those 6 stimuli if you want the people in your audience to understand you, to remember you, and at the end of the day, to be willing to do something to agree with your opinion or to follow you.
That's fantastic stuff. Now, Patrick, we're wrapping up this segment of the show. If they want to learn more, if they want to get your book, where do we go?
You can buy the book on Amazon.com, and the book is titled Neuromarketing, Understanding the Buy Button in Your Customer's Brain. And you can learn more about what we do at w3times.salesbrain.com.
So Neuromarketing is the book. You can get it on Amazon.com. You can go to www.salesbrain.com. Thank you so much, Patrick. It was incredible insight into the brain, especially into the marketing. In part 2, we're going to delve more on how they translate it into neuromarketing. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed the show as much as I did. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, we are there. See you next time, everyone.